Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. Today we continue looking back at 2025. Our guest is Jacob Heilbrunn, the Washington, D.C. based political writer and analyst. And I began our conversation with Jacob by asking him how he thinks 2025 will be remembered in terms of American political history.
It'll be remembered as the year that Trump tried and failed to impose authoritarianism upon the United States. I think the saving grace of the Trump administration is not its aspirations, but its incompetence. And the president has been rebuffed by the judicial system. There have been civic outbursts of protest against his ICE regime. And to sum it up, I think Trump has thrown a lot of stuff at the American public, but his poll ratings are plummeting. I've never been convinced that Trump could successfully impose an authoritarian government on the United States. And I think this year will be seen as a decisive one.
You noted Trump's incompetence. Does this reflect his own incompetence or the bravery and the obstinacy of the American people or the American judicial or constitutional system?
It's a mixture. Trump's petulance is one of the things that undoes him. The tweet about Rob Reiner. Today, apparently, he has posted plaques beneath the names of Joe Biden and Barack Obama, beneath their pictures at the White House, deriding their presidencies. Really, Trump is his own worst enemy. He single-handedly manages to sabotage and subvert his own presidency. Now that raises the question. Jamelle Bouie has an excellent op-ed in the New York Times today, pointing out that Trump in many ways is an absentee landlord, that he plays the role of president, but that it is people like Stephen Miller and Russ Vought who are actually wielding the levers of power, and that we've never had a presidency to this degree where the president, when he says, "Oh, I don't know anything about that," is actually telling the truth.
I wonder whether, though, that's profoundly different from Biden, who clearly by the end of his presidency wasn't up to the task either.
There are a lot of similarities between Biden and Trump, as much as he would like to dispute them. Both are elderly and both seem out of touch. And now the affordability issue is plaguing Trump. I think his poll numbers on the economy are the lowest that they've ever been, and almost as low as Biden's were. So once again, I think that the Trump administration is flailing. You can add in the Susie Wiles interview with Vanity Fair. Is this another attempt or an attempt by one of Trump's leading aides to divorce herself from the administration as it goes under?
Speaking of divorce, of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene has already officially, I think, divorced not MAGA, but Trump. How important do you think the Greene split with Trump is? She said today that the dam is breaking within the GOP against Trump. It means that, I guess, she's seizing the anti-Trump mantle on the right in the MAGA movement.
Maybe it's Green Day. She's doing it in a clever fashion, which is that if you're going to break with Trump in Congress, which a number of them probably will end up doing, it's best to be first. She's trying to claim that Trump is not a true apostle or emissary of the MAGA faith, and that she is. My own belief is that there's a good deal of opportunism in her stance, which is, of course, that she wants to run for the presidency.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone there. I think it's fairly obvious that she has her own agenda.
But she is a useful spear carrier against the movement. The movement is beginning to show signs of fraying. You saw that too in Indiana, where the state legislators refused to gerrymander for the congressional races. So that was another flesh wound to Trump. He has not yet had a decisive catastrophe in his presidency, though if he decides to invade Venezuela, which I don't think he wants to do, that could turn into a serious debacle.
How much of this, Jacob, is just comic relief, or it's not very funny, tragic relief? The invasion of Venezuela, which most Americans can't place on a map for no coherent reason. It's not even like Vietnam or Grenada. How much of this is Trump just having to create a new headline every day and assuming that one of these headlines will somehow stick and he'll seize back the political initiative?
There is an opera buffet character to it, but he has clearly signaled that he imagines himself as sort of a William McKinley figure in trade, and now I guess also in foreign policy. McKinley, if you recall, at the turn of the 19th century or of the 20th century, helped to launch America's imperialist phase. And Trump has signaled in his national security strategy that he regards the Western Hemisphere as the most vital to America's security. And once again, it's Marco Rubio who is driving this policy. It's not necessarily Trump himself. Rubio wants to notch Maduro's scalp. And then the ambition, as a Wall Street Journal editorial openly espoused the other day, is to target Cuba.
You wrote a book in last year, America Last, the right's century-long romance with foreign dictators. And you talked about this embrace of dictators from Kaiser Wilhelm and Mussolini to Putin and Orban. You know, McKinley, and I think you're right. I mean, it's fairly self-evident that Trump is reverting to some sort of weird 19th century Monroe doctrine. Was McKinley an admirer of foreign dictators?
I don't think that it went that far with McKinley. I mean, you had the war with Spain over Cuba. McKinley was an old-fashioned American Paul, and I don't think that he harbored the kind of aspirations that Trump and some of his predecessors have had. You have to remember that America was, under McKinley, was just coming out of its long, pretty much isolationist phase and embracing the imperialist mantle, also in the Philippines. And there was a strong anti-imperialist movement in the United States in the 1890s as well. Mark Twain was an eloquent advocate of it, and others in Congress too denounced what they saw as America's transformation from a republic to an empire. McKinley, no, I don't think he worshipped the Russian Tsar or other foreign leaders.
Yeah, maybe another comparison is Teddy Roosevelt, and certainly I don't think Trump could ever grow such an impressive mustache, could he?
No, and I think he'd have difficulty mounting a horse, frankly.
Yeah, I don't think Trump's ever been outdoors, but maybe between his front door and a car. But unlike McKinley, he's not a trekker. In all seriousness, Jacob, the thing that seems to me is you're in DC, you spend your time in and out of think tanks, talking to people who dramatize what's happening in DC with Trump. But the more this goes on, the more absurd it seems. And secondly, the less historically impressive it appears. It's the kind of storm in a teacup, which in a few years, everyone's going to forget. I mean, they'll laugh nervously about it and think, oh, you remember that time when Trump invaded Venezuela or did this or that or said this or that? But isn't everything just going to go back to normal?
Maybe. I think one of the things that Trump has engendered is that he has further heightened the powers of the presidency. And whether it's a Democrat like Gavin Newsom or a Republican like J.D. Vance, who clearly has presidential aspirations, Trump has fundamentally transformed the presidency. It would take a Herculean effort by Congress to reclaim its powers. The Supreme Court has done everything that it can to promote this idea of the unitary executive, which was first floated during the Reagan administration. And it essentially sees the president as not even a partner of Congress, but as an independent and quasi-Caesarist figure who can willy-nilly impose his will on the nation. And that's what Trump's tried to do. He doesn't have the patience and the systematic effort that it would need to actually carry this off, but a successor could.
I'm not sure if quasi-Caesarist, Jacob, is a contradiction in terms. It's an interesting idea. I think there's much more quasi about Trump than Caesarist, or certainly he's an aspiring Caesarist. He doesn't seem very successful. You're not alone in believing that this imperial presidency is the issue. The Economist actually has a piece today which, as always with The Economist, counterintuitive, suggesting that next year will be a year of optimism because the courts will put some guardrails around the president's emergency powers. And clearly there is a kind of imperial presidency, but isn't it also all appearance and no reality, just like his cruelty? He shows off about being cruel, but he's not effective enough. Whereas historically, American presidents have been cruel and have disguised it in goodness or ideology or ignorance. Trump does the opposite. Is it really such an imperial presidency at the moment, Jacob? Or is it, as you would say, quasi-Caesarist, which really means not Caesarist at all?
Well, we do see the spasmodic attempts of ICE in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles and elsewhere to expel illegal immigrants, if that's the phrase you want to use, or asylum seekers, or however you want to call it.
Undocumented.
Right. The politically correct phrase.
I'm not going to use illegals. I'll get into trouble for that. But people who shouldn't be in this country under the U.S. law, at least.
Right. Whatever. Those people he is imposing real suffering, and there are outrageous actions going on, and they do have the whiff of the internment of the Japanese during World War II. I mean, these are deliberately cruel measures that he is imposing to try and terrify Americans. And look, we know Trump feels it in his bones. He referred the other day to shithole countries after denying it for years. The person who's executing these policies, of course, is Stephen Miller, and is not someone that I would underestimate. He does understand how the government functions, and his calling for expelling essentially millions of Americans. And J.D. Vance appears to be on board with this program too. You hear all this talk now about heritage Americans. They're trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn birthright citizenship. If these things occur, that is a real change in the identity of America that they will have affected.
If these things occur, it's hard to imagine. But again, I guess some of this stuff was hard to imagine before, and now it becomes an everyday reality, overturning birthright citizenship. Jacob, George Packer was on the show last week. He made the comparison between Stephen Miller's and Goebbels. What do you make of some of these people around Trump? You know that they're the ones really doing the dirty work, whether it's a Stephen Miller or a Marco Rubio or a J.D. Vance. Are they in concert, or are they all fighting against each other to control a post-Trumpian Republican Party?
Well, they're definitely going to be fighting with each other. I'm not sure that Stephen Miller is as smart as Goebbels was. You know, Goebbels actually had a PhD in German literature from the University of Heidelberg. He was no dummy, even if he was a fanatic. Much more slippery than Miller. Are they going to be fighting with each other? They already are. There are clearly Vance and Rubio represent different factions within the administration, with Vance being much more solicitous of Putin, hostile to Ukraine, and intent on avoiding foreign interventions. Rubio, for the moment, seems to be riding high with Venezuela, but we'll see where that rides out. And then you have, of course, the external actors vying for supremacy, including Marjorie Taylor Greene. So the whole MAGA, is there even a MAGA movement? Could the whole thing just collapse without Trump? I think that's the real issue. I mean, with his, what people find to be his scintillating personality, he has managed to manufacture this movement into existence. I don't know that any of the others have the charisma of a Trump to keep it going.
I know you've also spent quite a lot of time talking with Tucker Carlson. There's, of course, the neo-Nazi controversy on that front. How much of that is smoke rather than real fire? There's Stephen Bannon as well, who seems to have more in common with Bernie Sanders than he would with Marco Rubio.
Well, Bannon is very deft at maintaining his audience share, and he always needs a new controversy. So he has shifted from being an ardent pro-Zionist to denouncing Israel now. Nick Fuentes, too, is battening on these controversies. Does he represent a real wing of
and
youth?
Fuentes, of course, is the neo-Nazi who Tucker Carlson invited onto his very popular podcast and treated with a great deal of reverence.
Now, if you look at these New York young Republicans whom Politico outed, they just hosted this fellow from Germany, from the Alternative Party for Germany, Markus Frohnmayer. And I guess they actually had someone wearing a swastika armband who was then tossed out of the meeting. And so there's strange things going on. You have Rod Dreher, who is a leading intellectual in this movement.
Quote unquote intellectual, I think we could say, Jacob. He was on my show 2 or 3 years ago, and I was really struck with his remarkable, I don't know whether it was naivety or ignorance, trying to support interwar Central European clerical fascism as if it was some sort of mainstream republicanism. I don't know whether he was willfully ignorant or just ignorant.
Well, he's claiming that 30 to 40% of these MAGA youth harbor anti-Semitic sentiments. Look, I don't know where it's clearly there's something there, because J.D. Vance refuses to denounce it. And both he and Trump clearly see these white nationalists as useful, and I guess in Vance's case, potential a voting bloc on his behalf. He's more interested in denouncing the left. Why attack your allies is the thinking. So is there more smoke than fire there? I'd say we don't know yet.
But again, the more I hear about it, the more you talk about it, there's a kind of springtime to Hitler quality about it. These conservatives idealize Hungary, a tiny little country in Eastern Europe without any economic or cultural or political significance. Another leader who's very full of himself and overweight. Isn't all this just kind of slightly absurd?
It is absurd, but again, Orban is in power, and there's an election coming up in April. in Hungary. There's a lot of
Quote
antipathy.
unquote elections. Orban's very good at quote unquote elections.
Right. So we'll see. There is a ludicrous element to it. That's why I think as the American economy falters, which it is, the ludicrousness of this will become increasingly palpable, whether it's knocking down the East Wing of the White House to build his ballroom or his denunciations of Rob Reiner. I think, yes, my presumption has been that the Trump presidency will end in some kind of debacle.
Well, to end, Jacob? I mean, the whole thing seems to be one long debacle. And in this sense, my sense at least is Marjorie Taylor Greene is perhaps the best position to actually make the case that Trump has done great damage to the American working class.
Yes. I mean, the looting that is taking place in Washington. What was interesting when I was in Ukraine was that the corruption scandal had just broken a week or two earlier. But it was the fascinating thing was that it was actually investigated, and then Zelensky fired his chief of staff. As Ann Applebaum pointed out, you couldn't do that in Washington. Kash Patel does not have the authority or even the ability to investigate President Trump. He would simply be sacked if he had the temerity to undertake such an investigation. So would Attorney General Pam Bondi.
You just came back from Ukraine. You took a 14-hour train from Warsaw to Kiev. Briefly, what was your experience, and what is the state of play in mid to late December 2025 in terms of the war itself and a potential peace, and of course Trump and Rubio's involvement and Witkoff's involvement in all this?
Well, perhaps it was naive of me, but I thought that there would be more of a battle of the Blitz character to Kyiv when I went there.
And you were, just to make it clear, you were a guest of the Ukrainians?
I was a guest of a Ukrainian think tank called Transatlantic Dialogue Center that has extremely good ties to the presidential administration and to various political parties in Ukraine. And so I spent a week with 3 other people on a sort of intensive immersion into Ukrainian politics and got a feel for, we talked to military experts, we talked to people who are on the battlefield, we talked to military, to generals, we talked to leading politicians, went to the presidential administration itself. So we got a pretty good picture of what the Ukrainians are thinking. Frankly, they have less trouble deciphering what Putin is up to than what Trump is trying to do. One of the generals asked me, what does this national security strategy that Trump has just promulgated actually mean? They were baffled, for example, that Trump would turn on Europe when Ukraine correctly sees Europe as its potential savior. So they are baffled by what's going on in Washington. To some extent, the United States is a black box. They simply could not comprehend that an American president would see Vladimir Putin as a more congenial interlocutor than his ally in Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz. To them, Washington has an Alice in Wonderland quality. However, the other thing that I came away with from Ukraine is they do feel beleaguered. They feel like their backs are to the wall, but they are not budging on protecting their own sovereignty. The thing that hangs heavy over Ukraine is the Budapest Memorandum that George W. Bush signed that allowed the Ukrainians to dispense with their nuclear weapons and proclaim that, Ukraine's borders would not be altered. Of course, the Budapest memorandum turned out to be meaningless. So they want actual security. And the reason they desperately need actual security is that in any post-war arrangement, to get the millions of Ukrainians who have left the country to return, they need to know that that Vladimir Putin is not simply going to take a breathing space for 1 year and then roll over the rest of the country.
Trump, of course, and you've wrote about Trump's remarks about Europe's civilizational erasure, whatever that means. They're not going to get it from the US. Is it conceivable they'll get it from Europe?
I think they will. I met with, these meetings were off the record, but I can tell you, I met with a leading diplomat in Kyiv from a major European ally other than Germany. And so
there aren't that many left.
I think you will
Belgium,
see, I think there is now an acceptance that you will not only see French troops, but also the Germans have also publicly indicated that they are prepared to send troops into Ukraine. So that would, in a way, be Putin's worst nightmare. Of course, it would be an unofficial form of NATO membership. It wouldn't be formal, but these troops would serve as a tripwire. And the diplomat that I talked to said, yes, if the troops are there and the Russians roll in, then the fight begins.
Maybe the clown is a little more serious than he appears. Couldn't one argue, certainly in comparison to Biden, that this isn't a bad situation, that the Europeans have finally recognized their own military, political, economic responsibilities, and that Trump, for all his clownishness, has forced them to do this?
The funny part is, I'm not even sure that it didn't backfire on Trump, because he wanted to muscle over Ukraine into signing an agreement that he could call a peace deal, that would have the appearance rather than the substance of a peace deal. Now Trump has overdone it in a sense. He's so frightened the Europeans, including the Germans, that they're willing to contemplate steps that they never would have considered even a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a Central European quality to Trump. He seems to be a confusion of a Schweck and the great dictator. I don't quite know. Depends how I guess he wakes up in the morning. You're back in D.C. now, Jacob. You're very much a Washington insider, an inside the Beltway kind of guy. You've been at the Center for National Interest for many years. You're involved with the Atlantic Council. Trump and his people declared war on your world. Has it changed anything? Or when they leave town, as they eventually will, inevitably, you're suggesting in a sense they may have already retreated, I think it's going to go back to the same in DC. You're going to have all these centers and councils still running the show.
You certainly could, because most administrations have outsourced some of the implementation of their policies to think tanks. There have been a lot of government contracts that have been severed to various think tanks in Washington. And I was with a member of Trump's National Security Council a few weeks ago at the Metropolitan Club for another one of these off-the-record meetings.
Oh, I never. How come you get invited to these things? No one's ever invited me.
Well, we'll have to rectify that. One of his more memorable sentences was that he said all the members of the think tank in the audience should go jump in the Potomac River.
Well, it's a bit dirty, isn't it? A bit cold in December.
It would be.
Do you think when we look back at this historically, the more I talk to you, it seems as if one way of thinking about 2025 is it's rather like 1905 in Russia. It's the rehearsal, maybe dress rehearsal, rather absurd dress rehearsal for a revolution that will eventually come. But this one has clearly failed. So in historical terms, how are we going to remember 2025 in a structural sense, in terms of clearly the fundamental need for change in America, which, for better or worse, Trump hasn't achieved?
Well, the issue in 1905 was that the Russians were defeated by the Japanese to their consternation in naval warfare. So, to complete your analogy, that would mean that Trump has about 2 weeks left to invade Venezuela, and the United States would suffer a
Yeah, although
humiliating
I think
blow.
comparing the Venezuelan military in 2025 and the Japanese military in 1905 is
Well, the Russians were humiliated because they were racists, and they didn't think that they were stunned that what they saw as a lower order of Asiatics could defeat them. And that led in part to the 1905 revolution, which unfortunately the Tsar resisted the necessary reforms. 2025, I think that maybe, if you think about it your way, then Trump is just an interregnum figure. I do think that whoever's running for president on the Democratic side is going to have to produce a much more sweeping and radical reform package than anything the Democrats have produced in decades. So maybe this pent up, suppressed revolution will actually occur in 3 years.
Yeah, I agree. And I've been impressed with Gavin Newsom's performance on social media. So I was intrigued to listen to what he had to say. He was on the Ezra Klein show recently. I know Gavin over the years. Everyone in California does. He's been on my show a few times. And I actually was struck with the fact that he still remains a fairly conventional politician. For all his attempts to appear Trumpian, he's still center-left Gavin Newsom in the Democratic Party in California, isn't he? I don't know did you hear him on the Klein show?
Yes. It depends. He's still got another year or so. I've been surprised by how forceful he's been on social media. His speeches have been good. Whoever runs is going to have to depict themselves as someone who's going to clean up Washington from the stench that Trump has left behind. To me, it feels a little bit like 1976 when Jimmy Carter ran against the Ford-Nixon legacy, was an outsider who had really no contact with Washington.
Although that's ironic because you've also argued that Trump himself risks becoming Jimmy Carter.
He could, because of the multiple failures on his watch. He could, he always hovers, as you've said, he can easily become a very derisive figure, not just for the left that hates him, but also for the general public.
I would like to see Donald Trump dress in a Carter-style cardigan. I think that would be the absurd climax to a particularly absurd year. I don't suppose Melania, whatever her name is, would allow him to wear it, would she?
No, and it doesn't seem like Trump is a Brioni guy. He likes the Italian suits. He likes the businessman look. But unfortunately, the idea that government can be run like a business is totally wrong-headed.
Yeah, to come back though to the failures in 2025, maybe you'll dispute this, but you strike me as someone on the center right of American politics. Do you think that the farce of Doge, though, will eventually have to be repeated in more structural and clear-thinking reforms of American government?
No, and I'm not sure that I'm center right.
Well, you're certainly not. You're certainly not a radical. You're a centrist, a defiant centrist, perhaps. Then
I suspect my own belief. I could be, all wet here. Is that we are headed into some kind of economic catastrophe, and that the calls for a fundamental revision of government and the economy will be quite powerful among the Democrats. I don't know that it's a 1929 situation, but I think there could be everything that Trump has done suggests, with the tariffs and with the embrace of crypto and the rampant looting and the emasculation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, I have an ominous feeling about where we are headed economically.
Yeah, and we've talked about that. We had Martin Wolf, the FT's chief economics commentator, who compared 1925 and 2025, talked about the Teapot Dome scandal. We also had Ray Suarez on the show, legendary NPR journalist, who talked about the impact of pushing interest rates down on the inflationary consequences, and with AI on the horizon and its impact on jobs. Are you suggesting that it will be more like 1929 or the mid 70s with the hyperinflation? What kind of crisis do you imagine? Of course, we've got the boom of AI, the stock market boom of AI.
To me, it reeks of 1929, unfortunately. I never thought it before, but it's clear that many of the assumptions that we have harbored have proven to be wrong. And what happened in 1929 is, of course, that there were runs on the banks, the utilities failed. Today, no one has proven that all this investment in AI is going to pan out. And you have a reckless president who is trashing willfully the American economy. So, I mean, Trump actually makes Hoover look good because
Hoover, I mean, you can say many things about Hoover, but he wasn't willfully trashing the American economy. He wasn't pocketing. He didn't become enormously rich through this willful policy. He was just asleep at the wheel.
He was an engineer, and he was a conventional Republican. So he was unwilling to engage in the stimulus spending that you needed. However, the United States would be marching into an economic crisis with an almost 40 trillion national debt, thanks to the trillions that Trump has slapped on. I mean, he's not actually investing in the country. He's handing out lavish tax cuts to the wealthy that have been financed by gouging the Obamacare. And now that's another element. I mean,
I've changed my mind on you, Jacob. You're not the center right. You're the center left, and you're edging into Mandami territory. And I guess in the historical comparison, then, in the late 20s, the equivalent would have been the automotive industry that drove the irrational exuberance of Wall Street, just as AI now is driving its irrational exuberance in the mid 20s.
Yes. You know, as far as my political views, you remember that famous quote from John Maynard Keynes? He said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?"
Yeah, I think that's a sensible response to me trying to position you. Finally, Jacob, in political terms, there was, of course, FDR waiting in the wings, who built or rebuilt a remarkable political coalition of racist white Southerners and African Americans, intellectuals, blah, blah, blah. I mentioned Mandami earlier. I don't think he's FDR. We talked about Gavin Newsom. He certainly isn't FDR, although he might aspire to be. Two final questions. Firstly, is there an FDR somehow waiting somewhere? And secondly, what kind of coalition needs to be put together to establish a way out of where America finds itself in the mid-20s?
First, FDR was not FDR in 1932 when he was elected.
Good point.
He was seen as a lightweight by Walter Lippmann, for example. Is there another FDR? Maybe. What FDR was a political genius, but what he did was he had an extraordinary cabinet that was able to carry out his mandate. So what you need now, I don't care whether it's Gavin Newsom or Pritzker, you need someone who's assembling a top flight advisors who have the ability to construct a sweeping program of reform, which the United States desperately needs. And I think Newsom actually could do that. He's shown much more initiative and energy than I would have expected.
Yeah, he's invited Marjorie Taylor Greene and Bannon onto his show. I wonder whether a coalition, conceivably, if there is the kind of economic crisis or catastrophe that you sense is in the wind, whether it's conceivable that you would get a coalition of Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Newsom all in the same room or all around the same table.
Maybe. Green's, Bannon is an interesting character because, he's not really wedded to the Republican Party. I think Greene is a little bit more.
Well, knows Donald Trump.
Right. But Trump, if he goes down in flames, as I expect, will be the Jimmy Carter, or if you wish, go back further, the Herbert Hoover of his era. We're not there yet, obviously.
Yeah, and I wonder, so you've come up with a rather dramatic scenario. I wonder whether one could equally make the case, Jacob, that in 2028, there may well be an election between Gavin Newsom and J.D. Vance, and it will be business as usual.
Well, it is the United States. I mean, what did Bismarck say? That God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, in the United States.
And speaking of Bismarck, I had a show recently, another podcast, which compared Trump to Bismarck. I don't think Bismarck would be too thrilled with that. But fascinating conversation from a man who I once thought was on the center right. Now he's on the center left, Jacob Heilbrunn. He's the author of an excellent book, America Last, a man who believes that Trump's best days are past. I hope he's right. Happy, healthy, safe New Year, Jacob, and we will no doubt talk in 2026. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.